Probably going to run out of stuff. So this one is still science because we're going to talk mostly about archaeology, which is still a science. But we're not going to talk about physics or biology. So some of you may appreciate that. But mostly this will be about history and archaeology. But we're going to talk about the Exodus. When I first started preparing for this lesson, and I actually put most of this lesson together probably about 12, 14 years ago. And I thought it was going to be a lot different than what it turned into. I thought I was going to have some really neat pictures that showed Roman chariots and Roman wheels at the bottom of the Red Sea and stuff that was like irrefutable proof. And I didn't find that. But I did find one thing I read is that Pharaoh's chariots were pretty much all wood, so they would have floated. So the likelihood of finding any chariot remains at the bottom would be pretty slim because they would have floated away. And the force of the water coming in when the Red Sea came back together would have basically splintered any of the wood and tore apart leather harnesses and all that kind of stuff, and really probably would not find a lot of the evidence that we think we would find. So what I ended up with was a lot different than what I thought I was going to end up with. And first thing I want to do is let's just talk about the Exodus itself. Did it really happen? You know, a lot of us are probably sitting here going, it's in the Bible. Yes, it happened. And I agree with that. But there are a lot of scholars, biblical scholars and secular scholars, that think a mass exodus of enslaved Israelites did not actually ever exist in Egypt and did not exit out of Egypt. They think it was more of a metaphorical type captivity and a metaphorical leaving. And the reason for that is lack of archaeological evidence. Now, one thing about archaeological evidence is just because you don't find it doesn't mean it didn't happen. So, one of the things for a long time, they thought that the Hittites were not a real people. And then they found evidence of the Hittites, and what they realized was that the Hittites were nomadic people. And most archaeologists will tell you that unless you live in cities, you really don't leave much behind. And nomadic peoples really don't leave much behind. And the Israelites, at least for 40 years, were nomadic people. So the likelihood of finding a lot of this archaeological evidence left behind, we're probably not going to find it. Now, that's not to say that we won't find it eventually, but there's not a lot of physical archaeological evidence. So, like I say, there are a number of people, a number of scholars, and a lot of them even are biblical scholars who do not believe that a real exodus took place. So, I think it did. If it did, who were the main characters involved in the Exodus? Okay, Moses was for sure one of them. Aaron. You know, I've got here Pharaoh number 1, Pharaoh number 2, Pharaoh number 3. Maybe even more pharaohs involved, but so, you know, we know that there was a Pharaoh when Moses was born. But we don't know who that Pharaoh was. You know, so for now, I'm calling that Pharaoh, Pharaoh number 1. It's talked about in Exodus chapter 1, starting in verse 8. It says, "A new king to whom Joseph meant nothing came to power in Egypt." And this may even be an earlier Pharaoh, the one who didn't know Joseph, maybe even earlier than Pharaoh number 1. So it could have been another Pharaoh a couple hundred years ago before Pharaoh number 1. You know, we don't know for sure. So we know that at least one Pharaoh came to power and he didn't know anything about Joseph. Joseph meant nothing to him. And then in verse 11 it says, "So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh." Now, since the Israelites were enslaved for 430 years, the Pharaoh that enslaved them in chapter 1 is probably not the same Pharaoh who his daughter pulled Moses out of the Nile. Because we know that's getting towards the end of the enslavement period. So that's probably Pharaoh number 2 and his daughter. And then we know, well, let me read that first. In chapter 2, verses 5, 6, and 7, it says, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. She opened it and saw the baby. He was crying and she felt sorry for him. 'This is one of the Hebrew babies,' she said. Then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, 'Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you?' And then 8, 9, and 10, it says, she says, 'Yes, go,' she answered. So the girl went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, 'Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you.' So the woman took the baby and nursed him. When the child grew old, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. She named him Moses, saying, 'I drew him out of the water.'" So, Pharaoh number 2's daughter was probably a different Pharaoh than Pharaoh number 1, because it's been roughly 390 years from when Pharaoh number 1 put the Israelites into slavery, and now when Moses is born, it's been, it's 80 years when he comes back. So it's been about 310 years. So, and then, if we look further down, after Moses killed the Egyptian, Pharaoh number 2, Pharaoh daughter's father, Pharaoh number 2, tried to kill Moses. In Exodus 2:15 it says, "When Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian, where he sat down by a well." While in Midian, Pharaoh number 2 dies. And Pharaoh number 3 ends up in power when Moses comes back. And there probably were actually 2 more pharaohs in between number 2 and number 3. So we're dealing with a lot of different pharaohs here. And it gets confusing when we read Exodus and it says Pharaoh this, Pharaoh this, Pharaoh this, and we don't think about that it's really different pharaohs over a lengthy period of time. So we know at least 3 pharaohs and probably more. And unfortunately, the Exodus account does not tell us Tutankhamun or I can't even remember any of the pharaohs' names now. I've got them written down here. But Ramses II or Amenhotep II, it doesn't tell us who these pharaohs are. And it also doesn't tell us that on 1400 BC this happened. So we just have the Exodus account that, Joseph's descendants are there and everything was going great, and then a Pharaoh comes into power who doesn't know Joseph and puts all the Israelites into slavery for a long period of time. Moses is born. He kills an Egyptian. He flees. He comes back. We know there's different pharaohs during that time. So I actually was still studying for this lesson clear up till about 6:15 tonight, because there is so much really interesting stuff, and I kept thinking, I really want to talk about that, so I want to clarify it. But an interesting thing I found, so I said there's not a lot of archaeological evidence. And so one of the things is there's not an Egyptian record that says, hey, we just put all the Israelites into slavery and now we're making them build bricks for us. But there are pieces of pottery with paintings and other mosaics and paintings that depict Asian slaves, and the Egyptians considered the Hebrews to be Asians. So the slaves are Asian, and they are making bricks with hay. And we find this in some of the archaeological sites in Egypt. So that is some evidence that says, hey, there were at least some Asian slaves in Egypt. We also, now I'm just drawing a total blank. Oh, so they also find some Egyptian records that have the names of household slaves listed. And we know that some of the names in the household slaves were Hebrew. So that also tells us there were Hebrew slaves. So we have depictions of what would be Semitic people working as slaves, making bricks. We have Hebrew names listed as household slaves in Hebrew or in Egypt that tell us that at least the Hebrews were there. You know, we don't have anything that says there were 600,000 or 1 million Hebrew slaves or anything like that, but we know that there were Hebrews there. We know that there were Hebrew slaves there. And a lot of the stuff, when we look at the dates for Egyptian stuff, it's really complicated. There is a lot of, I don't want to say argument, but disagreement, even amongst Egyptologists and historic scholars, on how to date a lot of Egyptian events that happened. A lot of the Egyptian dates and a lot of the stuff we have is based off of some writings that were done by a 3rd century BC Egyptian priest named Manetho. And he lists all the dynasties and all the pharaohs and when they served. But years after he had written all this and people had pretty much decided this is how we age everything, they realized that some of his dating systems, the Egyptian kingdom actually split into two for a time. You had Lower Egypt and Upper Egypt, and you had an Upper Egypt dynasty and a Lower Egypt dynasty that were running at the same time with two different pharaohs, but Manetho had put them down as one dynasty after the other, and it ended up lengthening a lot of the time periods. So we know that a lot of Manetho's stuff really is not that accurate now, but some people still say it's fairly accurate, and some argue about it, and based on the discrepancies of how they age things, a lot of people think that they could be off by hundreds of years on some things. So the dates I give you, take them with a grain of salt, because we don't really know some of that stuff. Now, there are two views on if the Exodus is real, when it actually took place. Okay, so the first view is an early date view, and it is based off of 1 Kings 6:1. 1 Kings 6:1 says, in the 480th year after the Israelites came out of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, the 2nd month, he began to build the temple of the Lord. So we know that Solomon lived and built the temple right around 966 BC. So if the Israelites had left Egypt 480 years earlier, that puts the date at 1446 BC. And if you're like me, when you start looking at BC, remember, the bigger the number, the further back in time we go. The smaller the number, the closer we are to present day. So the early date view is that it happened in 1446 BC. Now, the other view, the later date view, is based on Exodus 1:11. Exodus 1:11 says, so they put slave masters over them, the Israelites, to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. So this passage talks about the city of Ramses. And the building of this city is attributed to Ramses II. Ramses II was Pharaoh from 1279 to 1213 BC. He ruled for 66 years. He died, I think, 2 months into his 67th year. So he ruled for a very long time. So that is where that particular view comes from. And it's basically 19 years after Ramses II took the throne, the Exodus occurred, and then he ruled for another 47 years. I believe the first date is more accurate. Most scholars believe the second date. But we're going to look at these two things and see. And I know this table's not that hard to see, but the next one might be. And for all of you that think AI is a bad thing, I made that table with AI. And I made that table with AI. So it can have some good uses. So these are pharaohs starting with Amenhotep I all the way down to Ramses II. So we're going back to 1525 BC down to 1213 BC. So using the Bible, we can come up with when Moses was born. How do we do that? Does anybody know?
430 years from going into, which is age 76 something, or 80 years before, which is 40.
Okay.
And then also, what was his name? Judges 11, the judge says 300 years. We've been here.
Okay.
So three datings.
For me, one of the easiest ways. Somebody look at Acts 7:23. And when you find it, if you'd read it.
When Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites.
Okay? So, how old was Moses when the Exodus occurred? 80. So, if Moses was 80 when it occurred, and if the early date says 480 years before Solomon's temple, which gives us 1446, 80 years earlier from 1446 tells us that Moses was probably born around 1526 BC. And when you look at some of what most scholars believe, that puts it in about the right time frame for when Moses actually would have been born and when he would have been alive. Now, Ramses, 1279. So that doesn't coincide with when we believe that Moses was born and when most scholars say that Moses was born, which is one reason I don't think that Ramses II was the Pharaoh during the Exodus. There's other reasons too, but so when Moses was born in 1526, Amenhotep may have just been coming into power, or it may have been his father who was just going out of power, which I believe was Thutmose, not the first, but just Thutmose. So, Amenhotep was probably the Pharaoh, and it was probably Amenhotep's daughter, Amenhotep I's daughter, that actually pulled Moses out of the Nile. And Amenhotep's grandson, Thutmose II, was likely in power when Moses killed the Egyptian. And, because that was 40 years later, and that put it around 1486 BC. So 1486 falls right in this time. So Thutmose II was probably Pharaoh at that time. So, I still don't know who the actual Pharaoh would have been that said, let's enslave the Israelites, because it was 400 years before this, and I did some looking, and I can't pronounce the guy's name that was Pharaoh at that time, but it was really long and had a lot of letters in it. Started with an A. But Amenhotep's grandson was most likely in power when Moses killed the Egyptian and fled to Midian. Moses spent 40 years in Midian, so now we're up to 1446 BC, and Thutmose III is in power. And if you remember, it says, the Pharaoh who wanted to kill Moses had passed away. So not only is he gone, but Hatshepsut was kind of like a vassal, not really a Pharaoh, but was training Thutmose III. So we have a good bit of time period that has passed by the time Moses is 80 years old and he's getting ready to go back. And likely it is true that Thutmose III probably has no idea who Moses is. Maybe he's heard of him, but he really probably doesn't know anything about him. Now, as far as the plague of the firstborn, we don't always really know for sure. Typically the way it works is if you're king, your firstborn son takes your place. And then when they die, their firstborn son takes their place. We don't always know if these pharaohs were the firstborn sons or not. Sometimes we do know. But it's very complicated because you would have, Pharaoh might have multiple wives. And one wife would be the royal queen. And she would be a higher status than the lesser wives. So if a lesser wife had a firstborn son, and then the royal queen had a son, the royal queen's firstborn son was the prince heir, not the lesser queen's son, even though they were born first. But if Thutmose III was the firstborn son, would he have survived the plague of the firstborn? He shouldn't have, because he was the firstborn son. And all the firstborn sons of every family died. So if he was the firstborn son, he should not have survived. And we actually know that Thutmose III was not the firstborn son of Amenhotep. Because Thutmose I and second, or Thutmose I, I guess, was his... I know I'm saying a lot of weird names and it's getting complicated. But Thutmose I was Amenhotep I's son. Thutmose II died, and Thutmose III was also Thutmose I's son, and he took power. So Thutmose II and Thutmose I were brothers. And when Thutmose III took power, he was not the firstborn son, so when you had the plague of the firstborn, and Pharaoh calls Moses in and says, "Get out, we don't want you here anymore," it makes sense that he wouldn't have died because he wasn't the firstborn son. Now, the other reason I don't think Ramses II was the Pharaoh is he was the firstborn son. So he should have died in the firstborn plague.
And Myroneptah, his son, there's a stele that uses his name.
Yep.
Hickey.
Yep.
So he was still alive, so he couldn't have been just by now.
Yeah, and so, like I said, I was studying clear up till 6:15 because there is so much information about why this doesn't work. Another reason that Ramses II doesn't work out is Ramses II is attributed to building the city of Ramses. And in Exodus 1, it says they put them into slavery and they built Ramses and the other city as storehouses. So that would say that Ramses was Pharaoh at that time. Well, Moses hadn't been born yet because he wasn't born until Exodus chapter 2. So Ramses II only ruled for 67 years, and Moses was 80 years old by the time he came back. So Ramses II could not have been the ones who had him build Ramses the city and still been around 80 years later when Moses came back, because he only ruled for 66 years. So I don't believe that Ramses II fits all of that. And the only reason that most scholars say that Ramses II was the Pharaoh of the Exodus was simply because in Exodus chapter 1 it says that they built Ramses. So then I did some research and wanted to know, were there other Ramses a long time ago? There really weren't. There was Ramses the first, Ramses the second. There were 11 Ramses, but they all came later. But back in Genesis, when Joseph is in Egypt, it says that they settled in the land of Goshen, the land of Ramses. So we already know from Egyptian history that Ramses was a common name, and it's believed that Ramses may have also been a particular region of Egypt. And that may explain why the city of Ramses was built as a storehouse, and not attribute it to Ramses II. It may, there's a lot of possibilities. I'm not saying that they're all correct and right, but there's a lot of possibilities. Just because it mentions the city of Ramses does not mean that Ramses II actually had to build it. There's also, I got to looking at, so if Moses wrote this somewhere around the 1400 BC, then how old is the oldest copy of Exodus that we have? The oldest fragments date back to the 7th century BC, so about the 6 or 700s. We have parts of the Dead Sea Scroll and some others that are around 300 BC. So by the time this is being translated into the Septuagint and copies, it could just be too that the writer was saying, you know what, that city is called Ramses now, and I'm just going to call it Ramses here because that's the only place that people know it as. Because the other city that was built on top of Ramses may just not exist anymore. And it's really interesting that the city where Ramses, because there's a Pharaoh Ramses, the city was called Pi Ramses, so I'm going to call the city Pi Ramses so I don't have to say Ramses City. But Pi Ramses was actually built on top of another city called Avaris. And Avaris was the kingdom seat of a group of people called the Hyksos. And the Hyksos were Semitic people, and there is a lot of archaeological evidence that says the Hyksos were not Joseph's descendants, but there's a lot of archaeological evidence that says the Hyksos were somehow related to the Israelites, and that they had established themselves in Egypt and were ruling the northern part of Egypt, that when Joseph came to Egypt, with Joseph being Semitic and the Hyksos people being Semitic, it may be one of the reasons that Joseph found such favor with the ruler of the Hyksos kingdom. And the history of the Hyksos says that after a while, the Egyptians grew weary of them, enslaved them, overthrew them, and drove them out of Egypt. So it fits pretty well with some of the turmoil that was going on in Egypt during this time. And it's pretty interesting that you have these Semitic people that are there that have relationship to Joseph and are eventually driven out. Now, the thing about lack of evidence, if you're a king and you fail, are you going to publicize it? Probably not. Because if especially the Egyptian pharaohs, they were supposed to be gods. Gods are supposed to be able to do anything. And if all of a sudden you can't even protect your firstborn son or the firstborn son of all your people, then how good of a god can you be? So a lot of the Egyptian failures are not recorded because nobody wants to remember their failures. There was one pharaoh who attacked, it was Sennacherib. It wasn't a pharaoh, but when Sennacherib attacked into the Bible lands, he conquered several cities and he bragged about it on his prism. And when he got to Jerusalem, he just couldn't conquer Jerusalem. And Hezekiah was locked up inside. So instead of saying, I did so great till I got to Jerusalem and I couldn't beat Jerusalem, he said, I conquered all these cities and I kept the king pinned up in his city. He put a positive spin on it. And that's oftentimes what these rulers would do when you read their histories. And if you are Pharaoh and you suffered devastating losses through all of these 10 plagues, and then you lose your entire slave force, and then you lose your entire army in pursuit of them, you're probably not going to brag about it a whole lot. So you're not going to find a lot of historical evidence that's going to support it. And I actually found papers that basically support that and tell us that Egyptians really didn't publicize their failures very often. So, now we're going to spend a few minutes looking at the actual Exodus route, unless you have questions about this. Or did I thoroughly confuse you and you don't even know what pharaohs I was talking about?
Are these also kings?
Kings, yes. And I actually looked up because, sometimes the Bible says the king of Egypt and sometimes it says Pharaoh. So I actually looked it up, and the Hebrew word for king is very similar to the word Pharaoh. And then there's an Egyptian word that is very similar to great house that's also similar to Pharaoh. And they think, and a lot of the stuff I read basically said that sometimes you'll even see it written Pharaoh, king of Egypt. But Pharaoh and king of Egypt are basically the same thing. I was hoping that king of Egypt for over here and Pharaoh over here would give support for the Hyksos and versus the regular Egyptians, but it didn't seem to play out that way.
Something to add to this, in the Sphinx,
Mm-hmm.
there was a dream stela
Right.
between the front paws, and has it's for Thutmose IV, and he has to justify why he is Pharaoh.
Right. Yep.
The next question is, why does he have to justify? And he fits in pretty well with the Exodus too. So
Yeah, and that's this person right here.
died.
He had to justify why he was Pharaoh, because he wasn't the firstborn, he wasn't the prince heir. Some other stuff that supports Joseph in Egypt prior, there is a canal that was unearthed through archaeology that's called the Canal of Joseph. There is also evidence that, like I said, the time frames don't always work out because Egyptian timing is difficult. But there's a lot of evidence that shows that ancient Egypt went through a severe famine, and that for several years leading up to it, they seemed to be preparing for the famine, yet their neighbors, the Hittites, were not. So what did the Egyptians know that the Hittites didn't? They knew Joseph's interpretation of the dream of the 7 years of good and 7 years of famine, and they find large storehouses. And one thing we also know is that after the Exodus, that city Avaris that used to be Ramses was abandoned. It was empty. So that also kind of suggests too that perhaps a large group of people who were living there exited and left. Okay, everyone should be kind of familiar. Oh no, there's my map. With a map similar to this, minus the yellow stuff. I added that. So we have a route that the Israelites took for the Exodus. So I've looked at lots of maps like this, and some of them look just like this, some of them look a little bit different. I never really noticed that this particular route, here's the Red Sea. Where are they crossing the Red Sea? They're not. They're crossing this little lake up here called the Bitters Lake, which is sometimes, now they want to say it's called the Reed Sea. I don't believe this particular route, and I'll explain why in a bit. But you also notice that we've got these 4 yellow mountains. These are all possible locations for Mount Sinai. Now, this is the traditional Mount Sinai, but there are 4 different locations. Now, before I look at that, let's look at this map. On this map, we see that the path is now crossing the Gulf of Suez up here at the very top, not the Sea of Reeds or the Bitter Lake here. And Mount Sinai is located right here and also says Horeb. So Horeb is another name commonly associated with Mount Sinai. So we know the name Mount Horeb from other parts of the Bible. Exodus 3:1 says, "Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God." Now, either one, an alternate name for Mount Sinai, or another high mountain in the same vicinity could be Mount, so it is Mount Sinai Mount Horeb? Because it says that Moses led his flocks to Mount Horeb. So there's problems with some of these maps. And I'm not saying there's problems with the Exodus. I'm not saying there's problems with the Bible. These are all man-made maps, man-made interpretations of stuff, and I do think we have problems with some of that. So here's a little bit better look. Here we have them crossing this is the Gulf of Suez. This is the Gulf of Aqaba. These are both parts of the Red Sea, and here we've got them crossing. This is that Bitter Lake right here that's sometimes referred to as the Sea of Reeds. Now, these... Oh, is it going to make me push it 50 times? It might. These are all the locations that are mentioned in the Exodus route where the Israelites either camped or passed by. So, 3 of them you notice are red. Of all these 50 locations, the red ones are the only ones that we actually know where they are. The other 47, we have no idea where they are. So we have the starting place, sort of in the middle, and an ending place. How do you come up with a route when you only have 3 of 50 locations? Because we don't know where any of these other... And I actually went through and punched a lot of them in, and they still have no idea. They say, well, we think it's over here, but we really don't know. So we don't really know where most of these locations are. So look back at this map. Here we have the traditional Mount Sinai, but you have all these alternate sites as well. Do you know why that's the traditional Mount Sinai? And why we call it Mount Sinai? I know some people in here do. So, in 325 AD, Queen Helena, Constantine's mother, claimed that she had a dream in which God revealed to her that Mount Sinai was located right here at Mount Musa. And the Pope said, okay, if God told you that's Mount Sinai, then that is Mount Sinai. And once the Pope declares it, no good Catholic is going to argue with them because their word is infallible. So from then on, this became Mount Sinai. And the Sinai Peninsula here was never called the Sinai Peninsula until after Queen Helena said that's Mount Sinai and the Pope declared it so. Prior to that, that was never thought of as Mount Sinai. Now, if you read the Exodus account and they cross the sea and then get to Mount Sinai, if this is Mount Sinai, then the crossing has to occur before that point. Now, what do you notice right here? The land of what? Midian. That's where Moses fled to. And Moses was feeding his father-in-law's flocks when he went to Mount Horeb. Do you think Moses took those flocks and went way up here around and over here to feed the flocks? I don't. One of the sites is down here, and I think that most likely Moses was living somewhere over in here, and he came over to this area. There's a bunch of mountains in this area, and that's where he was feeding the flocks, and that's where Mount Horeb really is. And that's where Mount Sinai really is. So now, if Mount Sinai is really over here, then we've got to somehow have a crossing. We can have a crossing here in the Gulf of Suez or the Gulf of Aqaba. Either one would work out. And they have done years and years and years of archaeological digs around the traditional Mount Sinai, and they have never once found a single artifact that indicates there were ever large groups of people that may have been camping in that area. So it is believed now that, yeah, truthfully, that probably is not the real Mount Sinai, but that's still what they call it, and that's still where everybody thinks Mount Sinai is.
Monastery on that.
Yeah. Yeah, and actually Queen Helena had a lot of dreams and declared a lot of stuff to be parts of biblical things, and it turns out that much of it was due to political and power gains and really had nothing to do with actually being real sites. But once the Pope declared them so, that's just, the Pope can't be wrong, so they just went with it. Now, if you look at these two maps, ancient Egypt is controlling the Sinai Peninsula. Modern-day Egypt controls the Sinai Peninsula. Once the Egyptians crossed the Red Sea, they were free from the Egyptians. If you're in Egypt and you cross the Bitter Lakes, you're still in Egypt. If you're in Egypt and you cross the Gulf of Suez, you're still in Egypt. So how are you safe from Egypt if the crossing occurs anywhere over here? But if you cross the Gulf of Aqaba, now you're out of Egypt. And this is the area where Midian was and where probably the real Mount Horeb is. So it's more likely that the Israelites crossed the Red Sea over here somewhere as opposed to anywhere along this area. And this, most of this is not my own research. I looked at other people's stuff and what they came up with and read about it. But we know that a lot of the places that Queen Helena chose based on her dreams were not correct. We know through archaeological digs they were not correct. So go back to this map. And I'm not saying that my way is right. I just think there's a lot of evidence for it, and that's what this whole thing has been about, is I'm just giving evidence. And that's all we can look at. Ultimately, do we think that Moses crossed the Red Sea? Yes. Does it really matter where he crossed? Probably not. But, if I certainly don't think it was the Reed Sea. Part of the reasoning for the Reed Sea is that it was very, very shallow, and people tried to give natural explanations to why certain things happen. And this particular area was known for having really high winds that would blow water to one end of the lake. And since it was so shallow, you could walk across the lake. Not necessarily on dry ground, but you could walk across because the water would be pushed up to one end of the lake. So,
then was it deep enough to drown an army?
No. And we'll look later, it talks about how when the Egyptians passed through, there was the Israelites, there was a wall of water on each side. A shallow lake is not going to stack up to a wall of water on each side. So I really don't think the Reed Sea is the correct crossing in any way, shape, or form. Say they've got lots of these cities named on here. We don't know if Succoth was there or not. That's not one of the locations we know. We know the starting location, Ramses, and we know Ezron Gezer, and we know up here Hebron or Mount Nebo where Moses viewed into the Promised Land. Those are the only three locations we know for certain where they are. Let me see where I'm at here. If the traditional Mount Sinai were the correct one, We've got to have a Red Sea crossing. That's one of the reasons that the Reed Sea or the Bitter Lake is named as one of the possible crossings. And the fact that you can explain naturally how the water could back up. You know, I don't think we need a natural explanation for it. And it's only 5 miles from Ramses, the land of Goshen, to the Bitter Lakes. I don't think they would feel very safe. And if Pharaoh's army is in pursuit of them, why didn't he just ride around the north side of the lake and capture them? You know, it wouldn't have been any big deal. It would have been pretty easy. There was no need to go across in pursuit of the Israelites. And just because you went across a little shallow lake, how do you feel safe afterwards? I don't think that that's where that's the right crossing would be.
You have silting and all this geography has changed over
Right.
a couple thousand years too.
You know, the shallow bitter lake ignores Exodus 14:22 that says, "And the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left." And again in verse 29, "But the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground with a wall of water on their right and on their left." I don't think a shallow lake is going to give us a wall of water. You know, Exodus 14:27 tells us that Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak the sea went back into its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back over, covered the chariots and horsemen. The entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea, not one of them survived. How do you drown an army in a shallow lake? In a very shallow lake. You know, they probably could have just stood up. So I really don't think that that's the, you know, and if that's the truth, then okay, that's a miracle in itself that this little shallow lake had walls of water that destroyed Pharaoh's army.
I could be wrong, but I watched a documentary years ago about, I guess they found some archaeological evidence, and I could have missed you saying this, about the chariots being found in like the
Yeah,
70s.
that guy faked it.
Okay.
But I saw the same thing, and I thought, how cool. And when I started doing this lesson, I thought I was going to show really neat stuff like that. But yeah, it was discredited and found to be that not truthful. So, you know, this, like I say, this crossing really doesn't offer any security at all to the Israelites once they're on the other side, because they're still in Egypt. There are still other cities along here that would have had Egyptian fortifications and Egyptian platoons and armies. So the second traditional crossing route, which is the northern end of the Gulf of Suez, it's better than the Bitter Lake, but there are still problems with it. One of the problems is that, you know, we still have to have Mount Sinai be on the other side of the lake, so that still puts us, you know, you're crossing here from Egypt into Egypt. So again, you're not really safe. And Suez was a major Egyptian seaport that had quite a large army. So if Pharaoh is coming down in pursuit, why wouldn't he just go pick up reinforcements and catch them on the other side? So that's not likely where the crossing would have happened. And if I remember correctly, it's also extremely deep through here. There is a little bit of an underwater land bridge, but I think it's very up and down. And there are some people that did a lot of bathymetry studies looking at the depths and steepness. I want to say it's a pretty good grade down to that land bridge, and then you go across and it's a pretty steep climb up. So it's unlikely that that's the crossing. So I'm proposing this as a more logical, and there's actually, this website right here is actually, I didn't know it until I started looking last night, but it's actually a Church of Christ website.
That's my parents' preacher.
Okay. And they have, it'll take you a couple of hours to read it, but they have tons of explanations and maps, and They're not showing it on this map, but they show, if you read through the Exodus account, it tells you on day this, day this. They show exactly how many days it would take to do all of this, and it lines up very well with the days that they're talking about, the months and days in the Bible as far as when they arrived at this location and that location. But here they start out in Goshen, make their journey down going along the Gulf of Suez, and probably crossed somewhere down here on the Gulf of Aqaba. And then once they get across, here's Mount Horeb, where the burning bush was, and probably the real Mount Sinai, and it fits in perfectly. And there is a land bridge right here. And let me see if I want to give you any of this information. No, we talked about that. So, Migdal means watchtower. Etham means shut-ins. Baal Zephon was considered a sea god of the north. And, I thought I had a picture. There's looking at Baal Zephon. They might have seen that as this big mountain out in the middle and possibly represents their sea god of the north, because it is up here on the very northern end. And if we read through it, Exodus 14:1, then the Lord said to Moses, "Tell the Israelites to turn back and camp near Pi-haroth, between Migdal and the sea." And Pi-haroth means mouth of water or mouth of the canal. And here we have the mouth of the water leading into the sea of or the Gulf of Aqaba. We don't know for sure where Migdal is. We don't know for sure where Pi-haroth is. And then to go on, it says, there they are to camp by the sea, directly opposite Baal Zephon. And Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land, confused and hemmed in or shut in by the desert. And when we look at, there's a possibility that this is more what it looked like a couple thousand, 4,000 years ago. We've had a lot of water washing in and out. They have done dredging to make sea lanes and shipping channels in and out of the Gulf of Aqaba. But even if it didn't look like this, here's the bathymetry. You have a pretty gradual walk down to 250 meters deep, pretty flat, little gradual walk up, and then it's pretty flat all the way across this entire region through here. So it actually is a very good place for a crossing. It's one of the least deep locations. It's pretty flat, pretty easy to get across. And a lot of the other places, I don't think I have a map. There's an idea that one of the possible crossings could have been up here further north, but I don't think I have a map that really shows it. But that, that was a storm god, so yeah, right here is where one of the other possible crossings. And this one works out okay too, because it's not too steep, but it is a little bit steeper and up and down. It's not near as flat as this one. And like I say, I'm not saying for certain that this is how it went, but a lot of times we look at these maps and we say, oh, well, it makes perfect sense. Right there is where they went. And most people don't understand that we really don't know where any of those cities and locations were. And that crossing up here, if your map shows that, I would say it's absolutely not true. If your map shows crossing in here, I would say it's not true because you're still in Egypt. This was the traditional border right here of Egypt and has been for thousands of years. Egypt has always been in control of this area, so the likelihood that Mount Sinai is here is probably not accurate. It probably is more over in this area, which fits with now you are crossing, either crossing here or crossing here. You are now safely out of Egypt. So I think that's all I have. Any questions? I say this website is really neat. It's got tons of maps, absolutely tons of maps, and explanations for how they came to the conclusions they came to. So it's really interesting and worth looking at. All right. Well, if I've got no questions, then I'll start figuring out my next lesson. Unless you have ideas. Which I know a few people have given me some ideas, and I've thought about them, and some of them I just can't come up with a lesson on it. It's interesting topics. I've been asked a couple of times about climate change, and I'm not sure I can do a biblical lesson on climate change. You know, the only biblical thing I can say about climate change is if the world ends because of climate change, I think Jesus is going to come back first, and that's part of God's plan. Because I don't think we're all going to die from climate change. I think Jesus would come back, and then the world would be gone. So, all right, well, thanks.